The last video I made focused on what I believe to be the top 5 greatest last stands in samurai history. Epic moments of bitter determination and self-sacrifice that have lived on as legendary moments of heroism, inspiring countless generations to come. And that video got an amazing response, with all sorts of comments not only about what other samurai last stands people think are extremely significant, but also which of my honorable mentions they would have bumped up into their top rankings. So, based on all of this, I figured why not take the opportunity to make a direct follow-up to that video and talk about a number of additional last stands that I feel would be awesome to just highlight. I obviously still completely stand by my rankings of the top 5 that I did in the previous video, so this list is just taking the time to discuss more of them in detail. Another thing to mention is that most of these, but not all of them, are set during the Sengoku period, but we'll get into that. These are presented in no particular order, other than just arranged chronologically, so I'll leave it up to you how you want to rank them. And lastly, because I'm going to be covering a few more of them than I did in the last video, I'm going to try to get through them in a bit more of a rapid-fire fashion. So, with that said, let's dive in and discuss more epic samurai last stands. First up, we have Yamamoto Kansuke at Kawanakajima. In the build-up to the 4th Battle of Kawanakajima, the veteran Takeda general, Yamamoto Kansuke, had developed the woodpecker strategy as a means to lure Uesugi Kenshin off of Saijo-san, a mountain overlooking the plain near the Takeda's Kaizu castle. Yet, either through his own intuition or through sheer luck, Kenshin maneuvered off of the mountain and took Takeda Shingen completely by surprise while the Takeda forces were split, with the other portion of the Takeda army still on the mountain where they had thought the Uesugi were. Realizing his plan had been a complete failure, Kansuke, in shame of fearing he had doomed the life of his lord, charged headfirst into the Uesugi line, where he would die valiantly. Shingen, who survived the battle, with the Takeda actually coming out slightly on top, is said to have mourned Kansuke's death greatly. Up next, we have the assassination of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru. Throughout the early portions of the Sengoku period, Kyoto, the seat of the emperor and the Ashikaga shogun, fell under much chaos as surrounding clans tried to exert their will upon the government. By the time Shogun Ashikaga Yoshiteru came to power, however, he sought relentlessly to restore the might and independence of the shogunate. Yet after battling with the influential Miyoshi clan for several years, by the late 1550s Yoshiteru had fallen under the will of Miyoshi Nagayoshi. When Nagayoshi died, however, in 1564, Yoshiteru once again rose up. Yet this time he would be met with a force of Miyoshi and Matsunaga usurpers, who had their own plan to promote a more loyal member of the Ashikaga family to the position of shogun. In 1565, they led an army into Kyoto and assaulted Nijogosho Castle, where Yoshiteru had been staying. Waves of Miyoshi and Matsunaga samurai would assault the compound where the shogun's guards tried desperately to hold them off. Finally, however, with the interior breached, Yoshiteru was forced to take up arms himself. What is fascinating about Yoshiteru is that he is one of the few shoguns who too was extremely skilled in combat, being known as an accomplished swordsman himself. Yoshiteru is said to have cut down many enemies before finally being killed, making this also perhaps the most epic way a shogun ever died. Following this, we have the bravery of the Takeda generals at Nagashino. Shortly before his death in 1573, the legendary Takeda Shingen had launched a somewhat successful campaign westward against the Oda and Tokugawa clans. Yet following his passing, his son Takeda Katsuyori would attempt to continue the work his father had started, and by 1575 had restarted the advance. However, he would be held up at the Tokugawa castle of Nagashino, which had forced Katsuyori to invest into a prolonged siege. This had given the Oda and Tokugawa forces enough time to respond, and as their massive combined armies neared Nagashino, veteran Takeda generals such as Naito Masatoyo, Baba Nobuharu, and Yamagata Masakage all pressed Katsuyori to withdraw before it was too late. Katsuyori, for a variety of reasons ranging from younger commanders persuading him to stand his ground to other concerns about proving himself as a daimyo, would decide to engage the enemy armies anyway. The veteran commanders who had urged caution were left with no other course than to fight and die valiantly for their lord, no matter his decision. And die they did, as the Takeda forces were shattered at Nagashino. Many of the brave veteran leaders within the Takeda ranks gave their lives in the thick of the fighting. dying heroically for the Takeda in what would become one of the most significant battles in all of Japanese history. This defeat would cause the slow collapse of the Takeda, as it would also later bring about our next last stand, that of Okabe Motonobu at Takatenjin. Okabe Motonobu is really one of the more unsung heroes of the Sengoku period. Originally, he had been a loyal vassal of the Imagawa who had fought at Okahazama, and is even believed to have retrieved the body of his lord Imagawa Yoshimoto during the chaos. Later, after the fall of the Imagawa, he would join up with the Takeda and would serve Shingen during his campaigns. Yet by 1581, with things falling apart for the Takeda, Motonobu had been tasked with defending Takatenjin Castle, which had been taken by Katsuyori in 1574. Against the incoming tide of Tokugawa forces, and with no reinforcements coming to help him, he could never hold out forever. Yet he did so to the best of his ability, fighting bitterly to hold off the besiegers. Finally, running low on supplies and soldiers, his doom was inevitable. With this, at the head of his remaining forces, he led a final desperate charge out of the castle and into the enemy lines. It was here he died fighting in a legendary blaze of glory, giving his all one last time. This all leads to our next entry, the fall of the Takeda clan at Tenmokuzan. With the Takeda clan in full decline, their death would inevitably come in 1582 following a joint attack by the Oda and Tokugawa. Unable to hold back the overwhelming force of the incoming hostile armies, and with many lords switching sides to save themselves, the Takeda stood really no chance. Daimyo Takeda Katsuyori had been offered refuge by several of his lords who had remained loyal, figures such as Sanada Masayuki up in Shinano. However, not wishing to abandon Kai, Katsuyori instead led his family and remaining forces to the stronghold of Oyamada Nobushige. Yet once he arrived at Nobushige's fortress, it was revealed that the Oyamada had betrayed them too, and with nowhere else left to turn, and with the Oda general Takigawa Kazumasu bearing down upon him, Katsuyori would make the last stand of the Takeda at Tenmokuzan. It was a futile endeavor, and as the hordes pressed down upon them, Katsuyori and his family killed themselves, while remaining Takeda samurai held back the enemy forces. With this, the legendary Takeda clan was snuffed out for good. But it would not be long after that the figure who had destroyed them would too meet his end as well. As up next, we have the death of Oda Nobunaga at Honnoji. Nobunaga, coming off his victory over the Takeda, was well poised to seize the nation, with really the only final major obstacle remaining to his rule being that of the powerful Mori clan of the west. With the Takeda now dealt with, he could redouble his efforts and divert more of his forces to that war, which was already well underway. By the summer of 1582, he had ordered one of his most significant generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, to march out ahead of him as their forces were to converge in the west and tip the scale in favor of the Oda. There are a variety of reasons people have continued to speculate over as to why he did what he did. But no matter what the truth was, on the night of June 21st, Mitsuhide led his forces back to Kyoto where Nobunaga had been staying and assaulted his compound at the temple of Honnoji. Caught completely by surprise and with Akechi forces pouring in, Nobunaga and his personal guard made a bitter attempt to hold off the attackers for as long as they realistically could. Many prominent Oda figures were slain in the chaos of the night. Figures such as Nobunaga's notable page and lover, Mori Ranmaru, as well as Nobunaga's eldest son Nobutada, who too was a target of Mitsuhide's attack. The African warrior named Yasuke is also believed to have perhaps been present that night as well, but is believed to have either escaped or was caught by the Akechi forces, who then returned him back over to the Jesuits, who he had ventured to Japan with in the first place. Nobunaga is said to have taken up a bow and dispatched as many foes as he could before either running out of arrows or perhaps being wounded, where he was then driven back inside. With the temple now burning, he would commit seppuku, and his remains would never be recovered from the ashes. Nobunaga's death has gone down as one of the most significant events in Japanese history, as it marked the turning point of the Sengoku period, as the first great unifier had died, and the second was now set to rise. 18 years later, we come to our next entry, that of Torii Mototada at Fushimi Castle. Mototada had been a loyal, lifelong supporter of Tokugawa Ieyasu. The two are said to have shared a deep friendship, as Mototada had stood by Ieyasu throughout all of his campaigns. Yet, by the year 1600, with Ieyasu's great gamble to seize the nation well underway, the road to the Battle of Sekigahara was clear. It was here Ieyasu, who had been in Osaka, was forced to retreat back to Edo to defend his domain from the hostile Uesugi. With this, he also had to unfortunately leave behind Fushimi Castle, which had previously fallen into his hands. Fushimi was a significant fortification, and one that Ieyasu was simply not going to let sit empty. Besides the fact that if there was at least one force there to defend it, it would be able to help buy him more time. And so, he was sadly forced to entrust the defense of Fushimi to Mototada, who willingly accepted the task of defending it, even though they both were fully aware that this was suicide. By late August, the castle had come under siege by Western Army forces under the command of Ishida Mitsunari. Mototada mounted a heroic and resilient defense, yet he would not be able to hold out forever. And soon enough, as flames and death engulfed the castle, Mototada valiantly died for his lord, Ieyasu. He was 61 years old. But now we turn to the opposite side of the conflict, as we see the brave Western Army commanders who would give their own lives at the Battle of Sekigahara just later that year. The Battle of Sekigahara is perhaps the greatest clash in all of Japanese history, and no less epic are the Western leaders who gave their lives that day for Ishida Mitsunari and the Toyotomi name. One of whom was Shima Sakon. Known as an accomplished strategist, Sakon had been persuaded to support his old friend Mitsunari. Yet despite careful planning and preparation, Sakon could not foresee the doom that would befall them that fateful day, as treachery would lurk just below the surface of several significant lords who had pledged their support to the Western Army. However, one general that did suspect hints of betrayal was that of the leper Otani Yoshitsugu, who was particularly cautious of Kobayakawa Hideaki. So much so that when the battle began, Yoshitsugu is said to have arrayed his forces in a manner that also protected him against a potential attack from the Kobayakawa. Betrayal did come, and the tide did turn, despite the Western Army holding an upper hand in terms of positioning and holding off the Tokugawa. Sadly, Sakon's death would come first. After being mortally wounded, he would force himself back into the fray, where he was later killed by gunfire. Yoshitsugu, on the other hand, was to face the brunt of the Kobayakawa army as he had suspected. However, his forces could not hold out for long, and with enemy forces bearing down upon him and unable to do much himself due to his advanced leprosy, he would have a loyal retainer kill him and hide his head. Lastly, I need to mention Shimazu Toyohisa. Although the Shimazu were not a main feature of the battle, when they pressed forth with a daring effort to withdraw from the battle through the enemy line, they would be pursued by the notorious Red Devils. Toyohisa would give his life defending the retreat, and in the chaos, Shimazu gunners would even hit the famed Eastern Army commander Naomasa. Such legendary figures deserve to have their names remembered for such courageous yet futile efforts at such a historic battle. This pretty much does it for our coverage of last stands during the Sengoku Jidai, being that I already covered Osaka in the previous video. So what does this leave? Where can we go from here? Well, I could talk about the bitter resilience of the rebels at Shimabara, but I'm not convinced that it would necessarily fit within the parameters of it being a true and proper last stand, rather than just a force being withered out after a prolonged siege. This then leads us later into the Edo period, to the Bakumatsu era, and of course the Boshin War. Now, there are several engagements during the Boshin War that I think we can certainly call last stands, but the one I'm going to choose to cover here is simply the actual final battle of the war, the Battle of Hakodate. By late 1868, things were not going well at all for the shogunate loyalists, who had been fighting a losing conflict against those who supported a restoration of Emperor Meiji and a toppling of the old shogunate. This had eventually led them to flee to Hokkaido in the north, where they would establish the Ezo Republic, a splinter government separate from the rest of Japan, which would try to exist as a samurai-ruled republic. But the pro-imperial forces were never going to let them get away with this. From December 1868 to June 1869, they had launched a campaign to topple this fledgling republic. The Ezo forces would fight bitterly to the end, although in defeat it should be noted that many would end up surrendering to the imperial forces. However, one notable casualty who died fighting was Hijikata Toshizo, a man who had been a prominent figure of the Bakumatsu era and commander of the Shinsengumi. Toshizo would of course be one of the more significant leaders within the Ezo Republic, but as the end neared, he had come to the realization that nothing else could be done to stop the inevitable. It was here he would write a final death poem and fight on until he was shot to death. So, although in the end many other figures would survive the Battle of Hakodate, and some even going on to have prominent roles within the new government, Many, like Toshizo, fought heroically to the end, being truly the last valiant warriors of the passing age. However, there would be one more major last stand that we need to talk about, this being roughly 8 years later at Shiroyama. I did not mention Shiroyama in the previous video where I had ranked famous last stands because, to be honest, believe it or not, it was really not under consideration in my mind. For one, it really did not occur within the typical confines of pre-modern Japan. It was fought in 1877, in a time when the samurai class itself had already been abolished. Besides the fact that, yes, most of those who were fighting or leading troops were indeed former samurai on both sides. Despite this, Shiroyama has often been described as the last stand of the samurai, largely due to popular portrayals of it in such forms as the film The Last Samurai and the Sabaton song about it. In reality, the situation is a bit more complex. Firstly, it is important to mention the viewpoint that the samurai class itself really did not go away, but instead transitioned into the new imperial Japanese aristocracy. So often you hear the same old story of Takamori's anger about the former samurai class becoming less and less important in society and how he took up the fight to preserve their role, which does not seem to actually be the full truth. In fact, he had been an instrumental figure in the new government during the time in which most of the new reforms had done away with old systems. Rather, it appears as though he was more interested in simply the former samurai's role in the new military. But a greater cause of Takamori's anger rested perhaps in the fact that he was increasingly disregarded in the government, and was an extreme advocate for Japan's military strengthening and expansion. Yet, after his plans to invade Korea were thrown out and facing increased opposition, he resigned, followed by a number of his supporters. Within 4 years, he had amassed a force of disgruntled former samurai within his home of Kagoshima, and had established a private military academy to train and maintain them. It has been said that although Takamori actually had been a prominent supporter of many of the bold new reforms, these former samurai instead saw him as a symbol of traditional values and chose to rally around him. By 1877, things had reached a head, and he had decided to act. His initial plan was to march to Tokyo with his new force to perhaps present his grievances to the emperor, but he was blocked, and a brief war ensued. A number of losing battles would be fought until cornered, Takamori's forces would make their last stand at Shiroyama, where his forces fought to the end, and Takamori, after being severely wounded, committed seppuku. Posthumously, Takamori was pardoned and honored by the emperor and the new government, which probably would never have happened had he not been a war hero who had been so instrumental in winning the Boshin War for the emperor. Needless to say, the influence of Takamori carried on, not only within the Japanese military, but perhaps is even still felt to this very day. Obviously, this is a very complex topic, and I look forward to not only researching it more, but also covering it in far more detail in future videos. But anyway, these are just some more great examples of legendary samurai last stands. Of course, there are many, many more out there we could get into, but these are just some of the most well-known. My official top 5 ranking is still in the previous video I made, which will be linked down below, but I'm always eager to ask, what do you think? Given more of these examples now, what further last stands do you think would be significant to mention, as well as how would you end up ranking them? Let me know in the comments below. And with that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most interesting.